Well, frankly, this is just embarrassing at this point. NASA held a big conference call yesterday, Wednesday, August 7, with the media, which I'm going to play the question and answer section for you in just a minute, mostly in its entirety. Because frankly, the first hour of this press conference was just mostly NASA speak. Okay, but guess who wasn't at the press conference? Hint. For those of you who always call me a Boeing hater, you might want to cover your ears. Because that's right, Boeing was a no-show at the biggest press event so far this year to discuss the future of Butch and Sundance marooned in space. And that's because at this very important press junket, NASA announced that astronauts Butch Willmore and Suni Williams, who have already been stuck in space for more than 60 days, now will have to wait until the spring of 2025. That's right, 2025 before they can return back to Earth. And on the big news conference call Wednesday, NASA also said what yours truly has been saying all along. And that is Butch and Sundance, yes, will eventually have to be rescued by billionaire and private citizen Elon Musk's SpaceX Crewdragon. But the earliest date for the return will be in February of 2025, but most likely later. So they left on a mission that was supposed to last a week. And by the time it's all said and done, Butch and Suni will have missed a presidential unliving attempt. Yes, YouTube, figure it out. They will also have missed the current president stepping down. And they'll miss the big election. They'll miss Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, the Super Bowl, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, the World Series, the Olympics, and that's just to name a few. Man, that's a lot to pack into 8 days. But they will also be away from their families for nearly an entire year because NASA and Boeing, well, frankly, you know what? I think I better just end it there before I get in even more trouble. But now that you're all up to date, please don't click out because the press had some interesting questions for NASA and it was quite informative and extremely frustrating. And I'm going to play it for you now. I'll try and include as many chapters as I can so you can navigate the video. But if you're an aviation space junkie like me, you're going to want to stay tuned. So with that, stay right there. But remember, I'm always glad you took the time to stop by Maximus Aviation. Okay, let's go.
Thank you. Our first caller is Marcia Dunn with the Associated Press. You may go ahead. Your line is open.
Yes, hi. I'm hoping you can hear me. For Steve, Ken, or both, after so many critical problems, how can NASA have any faith in bringing Butch and Suni home in the Starliner, no matter how many more tests or patches are done?
Yeah, I'll start, Marcia, and then I'll hand it over to Ken. I think if we step back and look at the two big issues we've been working on orbit, really the helium leaks and the thruster issues. I think, the key attribute really to moving forward for the rest of the flight is to understand how those systems are used for the remainder of the flight and what the demand is on both the helium system, which is primarily the deorbit burn, and also the thrusters, which is the deorbit burn. And so we're really trying to understand the usage of the thrusters for the deorbit burn, and then also really delve into the physics of what's happening. I think if we could replicate the physics in some offline testing to understand why this poppet is heating up and extruding, and then why it's contracting, that would give us additional confidence to move forward, to return Butch and Suni on this vehicle. That's what the team is really striving to do, to try to look at all the data and see if we can get a good physical explanation of what's happening. And I'll see if Ken has anything to add.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit more there, Steve. I think your description was really good. Marcia, we try not to just make decisions based on how we feel about something, right? What we try to do is go in and be data-driven, look very closely at what we've got in the way of data and then and analysis, bring in experts, and try to pin down what our risk is. When we started this mission, it was a test mission. We knew that it potentially had a higher risk than a flight on a vehicle that has more experience, more flights on it, right? So we're at the point now where we see additional risk that's in a fairly broad uncertainty band, depending on how much data and how much understanding you have, you might take a different view of where we are in that risk band. But switching off of our primary path of bringing Butch and Suni home on Starliner causes us to take additional risk in the rest of our mission profile. And so we have to compare all those risks, and we'll weigh all that as we make our final decision.
Our next caller is Gina Sinceri with ABC News. You may go ahead.
I think this is probably for Dana, but how did Butch and Suni react to this announcement? Are they excited about potentially 6 more months up there, or however many months for Crew 9?
I would say it wasn't an announcement. So Butch and Suni are aware that we're always looking at contingency plans. I mean, this is a pretty common thing that we do. We've always got backup plans. Of course, they knew, before they flew that they had been fully trained, on board. The ground team has done a great job talking with Butch and Suni and keeping them included in all of the discussions. In fact, I'll let Steve share, but he's had some recent board meetings where they participated. Butch and Suni are ready to support, and they trust the ground teams. They're ready to support whatever we need to do. They're great crew members, great astronauts, great at flying Starliner. So I'd say they're prepared for either path that we go down, and let me hand it to Steve to share a little bit more insight with you in terms of communications with Butch and Suni.
Yeah, I would say, Gina, we continue daily, weekly to update Butch and Suni. They will, the great news is the station has a lot of capability. They can dial into our meetings. They dialed into our program control board last Tuesday, and we're able to sort of hear all the different various opinions of where we're at and all the data that we've been putting together and all the different risk assessments. So they're getting that data. I think Butch and Suni are ready to do whatever we need them to do. They could be coming home on Starliner, before September 24th. As Dana said, we haven't made a decision yet, right, of whether we pursue the rest of the mission and complete it nominally, as Ken said, or we have Starliner come home in an uncrewed configuration. So that's a decision ahead of us. Knowing Butch and Suni, they are professional astronauts and test pilots, and they understand the difficulties of the decisions that we're faced. They have complete confidence in the ground teams, and then they'll do what we need them to do.
Next caller is Jackie Waddles with CNN. You may go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for hopping on. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say I hope that we can get more frequent updates like this. It's been a couple weeks now since we've had updates on Starliner, and also would really love to be able to hear from your Boeing counterparts in situations like this. So for my question, I just want to follow up on some reporting from my colleague Eric Berger. So it sounded like behind the scenes there was some pretty serious concern about if Starliner has certain thrusters fail during undocking, that it could pose a threat to the ISS or become uncontrolled. Can you tell us if that's true, if that's something that's really being discussed behind the scenes? And if so, how big are those concerns? How widespread are those concerns? Thanks so much.
I'll start at a high level, and then I'll let Steve fill you in. So our strategy, we have fault tolerance for any number of things. So we've got sufficient fault tolerance for undocking, so we're not concerned about the, let's say, immediate proximity around ISS. The other thing that we've done in the past with the vehicle, the attitude that we're in when Starliner undocks is I'll call it a passive release attitude. So even if, for example, the vehicle did nothing and just drifted out, it's on a safe trajectory for ISS. That's not the state the vehicle would be in, but that's an added, let's say, layer of conservatism that is already there. And so I'm not sure what the specific concern is that you're referring to, but there is plenty of fault tolerance, plus there is safe, complete drift-out trajectory if none of the thrusters were working at all. So, Steve, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say, from a thruster perspective, the biggest demand on the thrusters for the remaining portion of the flight is really the deorbit burn. There'll be a few thruster firings to back away from ISS, and then a burn to basically take it over the top of ISS, and then I would say below ISS, and then moves out in front of ISS. Those firings aren't that stressing on the thrusters. Where we get into the next part of the flight, and again, the heating is not nearly what we saw on the day of rendezvous when the thrusters are firing very rapidly, not only to keep Starliner pointed toward the ISS, but also to fly it up the corridor and into the docking area. But the deorbit burn has a number of firings as the OMAC engines, the orbital maneuvering and thruster control engines, fire for the deorbit burn. 4 of those. The RCS thrusters will fire to hold the orientation of Starliner, to make sure it's pointed in the right direction to get all the thrust you need out of the engines. And that's the next stressing case. So it's really, the real concern is how many thrusters can we have fail off? We've done a lot of analysis that have shown that you can have significant number of the aft thrusters fail. In fact, you could have 4 failures of the aft thrusters, and we would still have great attitude control during the deorbit burn. And then after the deorbit burn, we need to maneuver to an attitude to separate the crew module and the service module. And then for that SEP sequence, the aft thrusters aren't required at all. Just want to clarify one other thing on the software. The software that's used, whether it be crewed or uncrewed, is the same software. It's the exact same flight software. What would need to be updated is a specific set of mission parameters, we call those mission data loads, to get into the uncrewed configuration. So the software doesn't have to be changed. The trajectory is the same. It really is on the software side, it's just some contingency mission data parameters in the software that if a crew weren't there, the software could then execute the checking and any response needed in close to ISS.
Our next caller is Bill Harwood with CBS News. You may go ahead.
Thank you. I think this is for Steve. Can you clarify what the actual risks are with the return? In other words, what I'm asking is, what's the worst case, given what you know about the health of the OMACs and the past problems with the RCS jets? You just mentioned you could fail off a bunch of them. It sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that as long as the OMACs fire, you're going to come down and the crew would survive that. They might not land where they wanted to, or is it worse than that? I don't understand. I understand keeping it stable during the burn, but I'm not understanding what the worst case failure here is that you guys are spending all this time trying to protect against.
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. I think it's really the worst case would be some integrated failure mechanism between the helium leaks and the RCS thrusters. And so for a nominal deorbit burn, as I talked about, we fire 1 OMAC in each of the 4 doghouses, and then the RCS jets are just there to hold the orientation. And essentially, we could lose a number of jets. It's really the multiple failure cases where if you lost if you had a helium leak in a certain doghouse and that took out the OMAC in that doghouse, then you could end up with some cases that aren't as easily controlled, and that's really the more stressing cases that the team is worried about. And then the team also really does want to understand the physics. Our white sands testing shows some degradation in thrust over time, which would be acceptable. The team also wants to understand the worst case ramifications of getting the thruster hot. So far, we have seen on the flights, on multiple occasions, we've got the thrusters very hot, but they also want to make sure there's no particular failure mode if the thruster gets too hot that we haven't seen yet. So I think it's more along the lines of looking at the most extreme cases on the thruster that the team's off looking at.
Our next caller is Micah Maidenberg with the Wall Street Journal. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, all. Boeing said last week that data supports flight rationale for using Starliner to take Butch and Suni back to Earth. I guess, Ken and Steve, just from where you sit, are you personally in agreement with that view from Boeing, or do you prefer one of the contingency plans discussed, or are you still waiting? And just wherever you are on that, could you please explain kind of the magnitude of debate within NASA about using Starliner to return the crew members? Like, how many people, for example, on the program control board are currently opposed to that? Thanks.
Well, why don't I start, Steve, and then you can kind of finish and tell Micah about the PCB. As I mentioned before, I think reasonable people could have different views on which path we should take. I don't think anybody is taking a view that you could prove is wrong or right. What we've got is an uncertainty band, and the Boeing team, because of their experience and their belief in the resilience of their hardware, that would take them to being very confident that the vehicle could bring the crew home, even right now with the uncertainty that we've got. But we've got other folks that are probably a little more conservative. They're worried that we don't know for sure, so they estimate the risk higher, and they would recommend that we avoid coming home because we have another option, right? We could put the crew on a Dragon. So that's part of the discussion that we're having right now. But again, I think both views are reasonable with the uncertainty band that we've got, and so our effort is trying to reduce that uncertainty. Steve, anything you want to throw in there?
No, Ken, I think you said it. I'll throw a couple things in, but you said it really well. It's about the uncertainty in the data. I think Boeing asserted their vehicle was ready to come home on Friday with the blog post they put out. They listed all the testing that we have accomplished jointly between Boeing and NASA in that blog, which was good. We've done a fair amount of testing. I think it depends on your experience base a little bit as to how you view the risk. Boeing is looking at the risk from the thrusters based on what they've observed more in previous flights, all the way back to, if folks remember, in 2019 OFT-1, we felled off 9 thrusters, I think it was, very early in the flight due to a problem getting the OI burn off, and had some severe heating, a number of pulses on that flight. I think Boeing looks at the flight performance on this flight, the flight performance on that flight, and the testing at White Sands, and draw some conclusions. I think the NASA community in general would like to understand a little bit more of the root cause and the physics. And then what uncertainty is there relative to the root cause and the physics? I think those are the two different views, different opinions. And, we're trying to work to get a solution for both of those.
Our next question comes from Joey Roulette with Reuters. You may go ahead.
Thanks. Just wanted to follow up on Micah and Bill's question for Steve or Ken. Can you kind of quantify the disagreement that the NASA team is voicing during these meetings or the program control board? Like, what number of dissents or disagreements are you having compared to those who are supporting the data, or in otherwise? And then real quick for Steve, who comes off, or for Dana, who comes off of Crew 9 under the contingency plan? Would that be NASA astronauts or the Roscosmos astronaut? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll address the latter question first and then talk about the disagreements a little bit. We're not really ready to share the data on which crew members. I think we'll do that at the appropriate time, should we employ that option. Relative to the disagreements, I don't want to, I think the best way to characterize it is the way I said it, right? People with various levels of experience look at uncertainty differently. And so the real disagreements are how much uncertainty they view in the data and how much risk level they view relative to Starliner. And now we actually, for the first time, I think ever in human spaceflight, while docked ISS have 2 U.S. vehicles to choose from in some respect, Dragon and Starliner. And so we knew the test flight would be riskier. The Dragon Demo 2 test flight was risky as well when we flew Bob and Doug in May of 2020. Now that we have had the helium leaks on orbit and we've had the thruster fail off, some in the team don't see that level of risk something that we should entertain. And I think that's where we're having the vigorous debates and discussions at the PCB and then at other levels, trying to gather up the rest of the data that maybe will help bring some other piece of data in that helps lower that uncertainty in their characterization of the risk.
Yeah, and just to give you a feel, we don't really count we don't vote, right? We don't go through and do any type of percentage as part of our process. Just one disagreeing voice can be enough, right, to sway the whole team to move a different direction. But I'd say we heard from a lot of folks that had concern, and the decision was not clear. Right, we heard enough voices that the decision was not clear at the Program Control Board.
And our next question comes from Michael Sheets with CNBC. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Given what Ken said at the beginning of the call and the variety of factors at play, I think 1-hour press briefings that don't even happen once a week aren't quite cutting it, especially when the briefings try to cover multiple topics at once. But I'll take my question to Starliner because that's the one I really want an answer on. Now that Crew 9's been pushed back a month, what are the timeline constraints on making a decision about Starliner's return? Or in other words, how long do you have to make a decision on Starliner's return, and when do you need to make that decision by?
Yeah, we're in the process of laying that data out right now. I mean, we've authorized Boeing to go lay out the plan, not execute, but lay out the plan for what it would be, what would be required to do the uncrewed undock, and that will get a first look at that schedule probably early next week. Remember that the flight control team for Boeing has trained to do the crewed undock with the crewed parameters and the software, and so we want to go make sure before we execute that we would dust that off. And then again, there's some changes for things that are automated responses with an uncrewed version versus the crew, and so we want to go lay all that work out. When we lay that work out, I think we need to probably decide, likely in the middle of August, one path or the other, to go ahead and meet the launch date for Crew 9 on the 24th. Given what Dana said, we really would like to undock Starliner first to free the port up. And then when we do that, we want to lay in some number of landing opportunities for Starliner. The opportunities are about every 4 days. We have opportunities in September starting on the 2nd and the 6th and about every 4 days. So we want to lay those in as well. So roughly mid-August we need to decide. And we're kind of laying out that path this week.
Our next caller is Lauren Grush with Bloomberg. You may go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much. This is for Steve or Ken, kind of following up on Michael's question. I'm just curious, what does the next few weeks look like for you? How is this decision going to get made? And who ultimately makes the call about how Starliner will come home?
Yeah, you want me to? You go ahead and explain the process there a little bit, Steve, and then I can weigh in.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. I would love your thoughts. We need to basically follow up from the Program Control Board we had, where we laid out data, but we didn't necessarily poll in a way that led to a conclusion, I would say. We have new data coming in. I failed to mention we have brought in extra propulsion experts from across NASA, from the Jet Propulsion Lab, from the Glenn Research Center, and from the Goddard Space Flight Center as well, to help. They are meeting here this week to see if there's some data that perhaps we have missed. They're working in concert with our commercial crew prop team and Aerojet Rocketdyne. So once we get all that data together, we'll have to come to the Program Control Board, see if we've closed all the actions as well from the previous Program Control Board, then take that to an agency flight readiness review, make a recommendation to Ken, and then depending on how that meeting goes, there could be another step with Jim Free and ultimately the administrator, and I'll see if you have anything to add, Ken.
No, I think you summarized it really well, Steve. The way it would work is it comes to the flight readiness review. I chair that review. We'll poll everybody, see where we are. I'll state what my position is at that time. If we have dissenting voices out of that meeting, then it can go to to the associate administrator, and if there's a desire to go even further, it can go to the administrator. The administrator, though, it's important to understand that the decision-making authority I have is delegated from the administrator. Same thing with the associate administrator, right? The administrator ultimately takes responsibility and has a very important concern and responsibility for the final decision. So he will be involved.
And our next caller is Chris Davenport with the Washington Post. You may go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. Quick, can you certify Starliner if it comes back without crew? Is that theoretically possible? And then just a quick follow-up on Bill Harwood's question about the worst-case scenario. Steve, you were talking about understanding the heat generated by the thrusters and understanding the worst-case scenarios. I just wonder if there's any concerns about the heat inside the doghouse, if that could affect the propellant lines or even ignite the propellant. I think you had said something about concerns about the propellant vaporizing, but I wonder if it gets hot enough, if there could be a more adverse effect. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take the first question relative to certification. We're laying out that data right now. If we had an uncrewed undock and brought Starliner back safely, I think we would look at all that data. There are many things that are the same with or without a crew. We would have to look at the things that are really needed for a crew on board, like how the ecosystem performs with the crew and so forth, and lay that out. Boeing has already moved out on changes to the helium system. We've talked about the seal that is leaking. Remember the P2D2 flange that leaked pre-flight? They've already moved out on a replacement seal. They're already laying in additional testing for the thrusters to make sure that we hit all the corners of the box on the thrusters. They're already looking at various changes to the flight software and the way it flies, such that it doesn't put as much many pulses on the thrusters and cause the additional heating. Relative to the worst case question on igniting the propellants, right now, the propellants are separate from each other, so you would have to get enough heat to actually rupture a line, and so we don't really see that as a concern. What the doghouses are really doing to us is keeping the heat in, and such that sometimes even when we fire an OMAC, we can get heat soaked back over from that OMAC into the RCS thruster. So we don't really see it as a ignition risk or a concern of combustion inside the doghouse. It really is more about will the thrusters fail off during the deorbit burn or some other time.
Our next caller is Kenneth Chang with the New York Times. You may go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This is with Steve Stitch. Basically, what changed and when and why? I asked you back on July 10th whether there were any contingency plans for Dragon, and you said, quote, certainly we've dusted off a few of those things to look at relative to Starliner just to be repaired. What you described today goes way beyond that. Was that July answer accurate, or when did you decide to actually get these extended plans started? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd have to go back and look at the timing. We started in early July doing some early planning with SpaceX for some of these contingencies. Then as we got closer and a little bit more data, we started to put a few more things in place on Dragon. We have this contingency option that we've been working a little bit more in the background for a while. In the last few weeks, we have decided to make sure we have that capability there. As our community, I would say, got more and more uncomfortable with the uncertainty in the thrusters, I think that, to me, upped the priority in having this capability in place. And really, what we have done is totally reversible. We can fly Crew 9 as planned, as we've been planning for years with 4 crew members, and we can plan to fly it with 2 crew members. And so as we got further and further into it and heard more from the team and the uncertainty that Ken talked about and I've talked about, we decided to put a little bit more effort on that, on getting the Crewdragon on Crew 9 configured to support the option. So.
And our next caller is Irene Klotz with Aviation Week. You may go ahead.
Thanks. Steve, did folks get less comfortable with flying Butch and Suni on Starliner following the discovery of the Teflon seal degradation during the White Sands tests, or what is it that actually had the sort of the public-facing view go from Starline's safe to come home at any time, that there's a landing opportunity, we just want more data, to where we are today with all the contingency plans?
Yeah, those are good questions. I would say that testing at White Sands and the discovery, really, that the poppet Teflon was extruding after the testing was a bit of a surprise to us. And so that I would say up the level of discomfort and total, not total understanding of the physics and what's happening. I would think that was a key change. And then, you would think that the thrusters recovering would be a positive thing, in that and I think I misspoke earlier. I think I said July 11th, but that thruster test was on the 27th of July, just a few Saturdays ago. They all seem to recover that Saturday, so that has given the team a little bit of, given what we saw at White Sands with the poppet, given that they've recovered, how are those two things congruent with each other, and then how do we understand the total risk level? And that's what we have embarked upon this week with not only our prop experts, with experts from across the agency to make sure we're not missing something.
And our next caller is Eric Berger with ARS Technica. You may go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. I just want to echo what Jackie said about transparency. SOX, back in your day, there were 2 briefings a day during shuttle missions oftentimes, and it's been almost 2 weeks since we've heard about this stuff. Steve, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the software configuration that needs to be changed on Starliner to undock autonomously. I've heard this is going to take several weeks to resolve, and so I'd just like to understand sort of why it might take that long if it's a simple change, as you described. Also, can you or SOX give an estimate on the likelihood of Dragon versus Starliner return for Butch or Suni? I know there's uncertainty, but is it like 50-50 at this point in your mind, or are you leaning one way or the other? Thank you.
I'll take the first question, and then we'll let Ken take the second question. So, yeah, we probably don't explain software very well, and I apologize for that. The software changes really are going back to what I would say would be the OFT2 configuration. And if you just think about the Starliner team, they have moved from May of 2022 into flying a crewed mission. They made a shift, modified the software to have all the capabilities that the crew needs. Essentially what we're asking them to do is go back 2 years in time and resurrect the software parameters that are required to be updated to give the automatic responses to breakouts near the ISS should we have a problem in close to ISS, which now the software allows them to do manually. The team is always updating these mission data loads. As the beta angle changes, as different things change, as landing site strategies change, they're always updating these parameters all the way through the flight. So what we really want them to do is, and as Dana mentioned, there's a slight change in the orientation of ISS at undock. So before we employ this methodology of undocking without a crew, we want to make sure we do all their work to make sure it's all tested and correct. We haven't done, I would say, any work since really May of 2022 when we had OFT2 on the uncrewed config. We've had the Boeing and NASA teams focus solely on working toward returning Starliner in a crewed configuration. Before we go execute that, it's just smart and responsible to go take the software and the mission data loads in this configuration, go into the integrated test facility. We call it ASIL, which is where all the flight software resides, all the flight hardware associated with the avionics resides, and then go run it through some test cases just to make sure we haven't missed anything. That's really what we would go do. That's really what would take the time if we were to pivot to an uncrewed undock. that's what we would go spend our time on. And I'll let Ken answer the second question.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for the thoughts on the press conferences. I appreciate that, and really appreciate your interest and how hard you're working to get accurate information out there to everybody. To give you a number, it's just really hard right now. I can't give you one. It could change drastically one way or another depending on new data. But I would say that our chances of an uncrewed Starliner return have increased a little bit based on where things have gone over the last week or two, and that's why we're looking more closely at that option to make sure that we can handle it. But again, new data coming in, new analysis, different discussion, we could find ourselves shifting another way.
And our next caller is Anthony Leone with Spectrum News. You may go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking our questions today. It's a shame that Mark Nappy isn't there. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has a few questions for him. My question is this. Going forward, what is the future of Starliner, and will NASA change some of its recommendations of testing spacecraft before a crew can actually board on there? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the path forward for Starliner is to complete the rest of the test flight to undock. I would like it to undock with the crew, but if we don't end up getting there with the entire community, undock, execute the deorbit burn, return home, and then make the corrections to the problems that we've found. These problems can be fixed. The helium leak, it's maybe changing out the seal that we talked about and looking at that system and changing maybe the way that system's put together. And then the thrusters, doing a little bit more testing at White Sands, and then figuring out how to fire them less. So I see a bright future for Starliner. Either way, we really need two crew transportation systems. There could be a day in the future where we're calling upon Starliner to do something for us like this. And it's a great vehicle. It's got great capability. And, Boeing has done a tremendous job working on it in concert with commercial crew. And so I really see that there's a viable path for Starliner either way that we go. In terms of testing vehicles or changing the way the requirement to have this uncrewed test flight and then a crewed test flight, I think so far that's worked well for us. I think the one area that we probably had a miss in is the doghouses and the thermal effect in the doghouses and what effects that caused on the thruster, that it's not easily tested on the ground. It's not easily analyzed. It's not easy to put the whole doghouse and service module in a chamber and fire the thrusters. And so that's probably the one thing that we probably need to think about a little bit more. Is there something that we could do differently there to make sure we didn't have these kinds of problems in flight?
And our next caller is Tim Fernholz with Payload Space. You may go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. Always good to get an opportunity to talk with you folks about this. I just want to make sure for Ken and Steve that I understand the situation. Right now we're hoping to get a root cause for the issues with the propulsion system before a decision is made on which vehicle the astronauts will return on. And we're going to do that by mid-August, and we're going to do that by analyzing the existing data and bringing in new propulsion experts from across NASA. But we don't anticipate any new testing. Is that right? And just a quick second thing, what's the story with the water intrusion on the Falcon 9 for Crew 9? Thank you.
Yeah, let me see if I can take the first question. We have brought in extra experts, and we are trying to do some tests on the ground. We've got a couple theories about how to test this Teflon. We don't have a lot of data at high temperatures, and so how it performs at high temperatures and cooler temperatures. So that's something we're off working on. Can we come up with a test to do that? There may be other tests that we determine are necessary in the near term that we may embark upon. And then we're building a model also of the Teflon to see, it's called a finite element model. You break the Teflon up into little pieces, and you expose that model to the thermal and forces that it sees, and then try to understand how that material swells over time when exposed to temperature. So we're doing that work as well. Relative to Falcon 9 first stage water intrusion, there was some moisture that went into the fuel in the LOX tank of that booster when it was transported from McGregor to the Cape. The desiccant system didn't perform the way it was supposed to. That desiccant system is supposed to keep that air dry, and so it didn't perform the way it was supposed to, so we had to dry those tanks out and then replace a few components on the vehicle. And so getting a shakedown flight of that on a Starlink would be helpful for us. That's just kind of a side benefit of moving from August to September.
And our next caller is Will Robinson-Smith with Spaceflight Now. You may go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking the time. Question to either Steve or Ken. Given what is now known about Starliner and the testing and analysis that is still yet ahead, if there were a contingency scenario where an emergency were to happen on station, does NASA still feel like Starliner is a safe vehicle for Butch and Suni to return on now if it were needed to be called upon today? And then just a quick second follow-up to Steve. Can you update us on the status of the second stage analysis for the crew flight test, or for the Crew 9 flight? Thanks.
Let's see, relative to the first question on the contingency return capability, we still agree that the right course of action would be to return Butch and Suni in Starliner. Should there be an emergency at ISS where it's an uninhabitable environment or they need to get off station, Starliner would be their best option, and we still feel confident in that. Relative to the second question, we have been following along with the FAA's investigation on the second stage anomaly on the Merlin vacuum engine, what we call the MVAC engine. Our second stage has been through testing at McGregor with the modifications that we spoke of on the press event. I think that press event was on the 26th, or maybe it was the 19th of July. So it's been through the stage testing at McGregor. We removed that sense line, removed the transducer from the vehicle, tested that vehicle. The testing all went well. SpaceX has flown now, I'm probably losing track, at least 3 or 4 Starlinks, plus the NG-21 flight with the modification. Our team's feeling pretty good about that. We swapped out the turbine housing, and we're working through that swap out, and that's coming to the program control board Thursday, which is tomorrow. So that's the latest status on the second stage on Crew 9.
Yeah, and well, this is Ken. It may be confusing folks that we're willing to put the crew on for a contingency return, but still talking about the planned return. And part of that is how we make decisions about risk in contingency situations. It's pretty unlikely to get into one of those contingency situations, number one. And then number two, because of the criticality of those situations, we typically would be willing to accept a little more risk. So that's how you get this apparent difference in what we would be willing to do in the different situations.
Our next caller is Isam Ahmed with AFP. You may go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for doing this. I was just wondering, given the sort of fundamental flaws that have been uncovered in this sort of design process, what does that mean for the future of the certification process? If Butch and Suni do come home on the Starliner, will it certainly be certified, or could there be a possibility of more work needs to be done? And we can see that Boeing has some blame here, but does NASA also share some blame in failing to oversee them adequately and allowing these design flaws to go unnoticed?
Yeah, obviously the certification process isn't really just about landing, and then if the landing goes well, that vehicle is certified. We have a whole process of certification that we needed to go through relative to the data that's obtained from this flight. We obtain pressure data, data that's recorded on board. We'll go look at all that data. And then there's a number of changes that Boeing will be rolling in for Starliner 1 that we've talked about. I think we mentioned like in the area where the landing loads are the highest, called an airbag backing panel. It's where the airbag's essentially attached to the structure of Starliner. That's going to be modified, and we have to go through certification on that. I think we've talked about the suits and seats are going to have some modifications. Obviously, the flight software has modifications to go to both the forward port and the zenith port, so there's many modifications that have to be certified. The changes to the dog houses relative to helium would undergo certification as well, and that data would be given to NASA along with whatever the changes to the way the vehicle flies to reduce the demand on the thrusters in terms of the heating. Relative to, the certification process and how we got here in flight, I think we'll have to go back and look at that. We see things on every flight that are a bit of a struggle for engineers to explain why did we miss that. We had that in Space Shuttle. I remember a flight, STS-95, where that many flights into the program, the drag chute door, when the engine started at liftoff, the drag chute door fell off, contacted the engine, and then we had to go work in the flight. Was the drag chute safe to deploy, or were we worried about it coming out? So that, you could say, was a certification miss. Obviously, Orion is dealing with, what they learned on the heat shield from their test flight as well, Artemis 1. It's every test flight, every time we fly, we learn something new. SpaceX, after 300 Falcon 9 flights, found when they made a very simple design change, removed a bracket and changed the transducer on the Starlink flight that had the MBEC anomaly, ended up having a failure of the engine. So I think it's really tough, this business is. I always do a bunch of soul searching afterwards, like what did we miss, and we'll do that, and we'll see if there's anything we can improve in our processes.
Our next caller is Elizabeth Howell with Space.com. You may go ahead.
Thanks, everyone, for your time. This might be for Dana. Can you clarify, if possible, who would be flying on Crew 9 if it was only 2 astronauts? Would it be the pilot and the commander, for example? And I'm also wondering about the implications for future missions. If it was only 2 going up, would that affect the composition for Crew 10, for Crew 11, and the alliances with other space agencies such as Roscosmos? Thanks very much.
Let's see, just to echo what Steve said, we're not ready to share specific crew names for the contingency plan. If we find ourselves in a position where we do make a decision that we're not going to fly Starliner back with Butch and Suni, we'll share those details at that time. But more generically, sending up to and then having Butch and Suni stay on board, just to kind of walk through that. So they stay on board and they end up doing the full increment. Crew 8 comes home with a normal Crew 8, and then at that point in time, we're back into our normal rotation plan. So there are no other deltas or changes. It's just a specific change to Crew 9 dropping down to 2 crew.
Our next caller is Jeff Faust with Space News. You may go ahead.
Thank you. And then I'll welcome my colleague who wants us to be the first of a more frequent series of briefings during this dynamic time on station. For Steve, are there particular data sets or analyses that you are counting on to make a decision on whether to have Starliner return with the crew or not? For example, do you need to understand the physics of what's going on in the thruster with the seals expanding and the propellant vaporizing before you would approve having a crew come back on Starliner? Thanks.
Yeah, I think the team would like us to understand that physics a little bit better to try to answer the understanding of this, why this Teflon is swelling, and then why is it likely that it basically restored itself back to a normal configuration such that the flow returns so that we get nominal thrust, which we saw when we did that docked hot fire on the 27th of July. So that's some key data. And then anything that we can do with thruster experts or testing to understand the potential uncertainties and to make sure that there's no way that there's a real serious catastrophic failure mode of the thruster. So far, what we've heard from Aerojet and experts is that's not true, but we're making sure we do our due diligence to understand if there's a potential failure mode that where the thruster could have a leak or something like that. So far, we haven't seen that, but that's really the data that we're taking our time to go through that data.
Next caller is Marina Corin with The Atlantic. You may go ahead.
Hi, a question for Steve. In your discussions with SpaceX, have you considered organizing an entirely new Dragon flight to bring Butch and Suni home so that they don't have to remain on station until February 2025? And a quick one for Ken. My colleagues on this call have already said that we would have really liked to hear from someone at Boeing today, but I do want to ask, why isn't Mark or another Boeing representative on the call today? And given the amount of work that you've done with SpaceX to prepare for the contingency plans you're telling us about today, why isn't a SpaceX representative on this call? Thanks.
Well, I'll let Ken. Why don't
I do the last one first, Steve, and then you can go, huh?
Sure.
Today we wanted to just kind of give you the NASA team's point of view on all the complicated issues on ISS. We'll have chances to bring Boeing back along with SpaceX in the future as we progress. Today I really wanted those guys to be able to work on the technical issues rather than being here at the press conference, but we'll give them an opportunity in the future. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah. The relative to sending up a new Dragon so that Butch and Suni didn't have to stay up till February, we really never considered that option from the very beginning. We liked the option of modifying Crew 9 or Crew 8. We looked at both of those and bringing them back in either one of those vehicles. We're trying to lay out the rest of our manifest, to make sure we have vehicles available for all the flights. It just didn't make sense to go ahead and accelerate a flight, SpaceX, to return Butch and Suni earlier.
Our next caller is Clayton Sandell with Scripps News. You may go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. One of my questions just got answered, but I will ask, we haven't heard from Butch or Suni since July 10th, and I was hoping you might commit to having them participate in another on-orbit press conference as soon as one can be scheduled. Thanks.
Our plan is, once we make the decision, and hopefully, as Steve said, that's mid-August, we're planning onboard station to set up a press conference with Butch and Suni. So that'll be coming around the corner when we have our decision made.
And our next caller is Stephen Young with Spaceflight Now. You may go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question on the timing and sequencing. You're going to have to depart the Crew 8 Dragon and Starliner and dock Crew 9. How is that all going to work? What is going to be the lifeboat plan for Butch and Suni if Starliner goes first? And you also did an inspection of Starliner with the robot arm after the hot fire test. I'm wondering why that was performed and what you might have learned during that.
Yeah, I'll take the last question first. We did an inspection. I believe it was on July 30th of the vehicle. We did a standard MMOD survey, lining us up for the next set of undock opportunities. That's good for a number of days. I have to go back and check on how many days that's good for. So it's just an opportunity to take a look at the vehicle and see if there was any MMOD damage at all. Relative to the sequence that we're talking about, so the first event in the sequence is Starliner has to undock first. That would free up the forward port on the space station. Then, right now, that would happen first. And then after that, we will do a port relocation to move. Once we launch Crew 9 we'll launch Crew 9 next. That will be the next launch. We'll dock to the forward port, the forward IDA. After that vehicle docks, then we would have Crew 8 undock and return. And then before the cargo flight, we want to relocate the Crew 9 Dragon from the forward port to the zenith port because the next vehicle, we would like it on the forward port to do some demonstration. And I'll let Dana talk about that.
Let me just add one thing in the sequence. You specifically used the word Lifeboat and talking about Starliner going first. So before we would undock Starliner, Steve mentioned previously we were putting in place work for the Dragon crewed vehicle to have up to 7 people. So basically you can do 5, 6, or 7. It covers all different crew configurations. The first step would be if we were doing an uncrewed Starliner undocking, we would first configure the Crew 8 Dragon vehicle to be able to handle the 2 additional crew members. So we would put a contingency configuration in place first to make sure we have a contingency return vehicle ready. Then we would undock Starliner. Then we would launch Crew 9, launch Crew 8, do the handover. Crew 8 will leave. Then, as Steve said, we would relocate Crew 9 to get ready for our cargo mission. So that's how we would handle the lifeboat configuration for the uncrewed undock scenario.
And thanks, Dana. I feel for reporters that have to understand that whole thing, because as we talk it's very complicated. So.
Our next caller is Ryan Caton with NSF. You may go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. Very quickly, I will also echo the comments earlier. More frequent conferences and transparency is really, we really desire that. I understand you do not want to name the astronauts right now, but in the event that 2 up, 4 down Crew 9 contingency is activated, do you know when those 2 astronauts which are bumped off Crew 9 would fly? Will 2 astronauts on every future Dragon mission now be bumped 1 flight further down the line, or how's that going to work out? Thanks.
We haven't worked through those specific details. We tend to assign crew in general a couple of years out to get them into training, but in this particular case, we've got crew members who are already proficient and trained, so our flexibility is much higher in this particular case. They're fully qualified to go fly on ISS, do all the ISS work, they're fully qualified for Dragon. So if we found ourselves in that situation, that's something we'd do, is we'd go look at future manifests and just see what makes sense for the overall crew complements going forward.
And our next caller is Anthony Colangelo with Marine Engine Cutoff. You may go ahead.
Hey there, thanks. If the decision were made to send Starliner out uncrewed, is there additional testing that you would do on the way back before re-entry, or would you fly it exactly as if the crew was on board for the certification stuff that you talked about earlier? Thanks.
Very good question. The one thing that we're thinking about or talking about what to do with is the additional hot fires once we undock. Should we hot fire all the thrusters again to understand their performance, or there's this one thruster that had severely degraded thrust on docking day, B1A3. Should we hot fire that thruster? That's really the main thing that we've been talking about doing relative to the undock subsequence in the deorbit burn.
Our next caller is Manuel Mazzanti with Exploración Espacial. You may go ahead.
Thank you very much, Manuel Mazzanti, Exploración Espacial. A question for Dana, following previous comments. I know that you cannot mention names so far, but in the case that this contingency plan moves forward, launching Crew 9 with 2 members, what would be the rationale? Would it be based on the activities they need to perform, like science-based, prioritizing science, EVA, maintenance, international partners? And a quick second question, have you ever considered modifying Crew 9 in some way that you can return with 6 astronauts, like the original Crew 9 plus Butch and Suni, given the fact that Crewdragon could handle 7 astronauts, I guess? Thank you.
All right, I'll take that first one, and then I'll let Steve talk about the second one. There are a lot of things that we take into consideration when you look at crew complements, and in a case like this, specifically looking at Butch and Suni's training and the rest of the crew complement and what makes sense both for ISS, but also specifically for the Dragon. The Crew 9 crew trained together with 4 crew. Though in this case, we have this contingency. They'd fly up with 2, so we're looking at all of those factors combined to make sure that we make the right decision. And I'll let Steve answer the second one.
Yeah, relative to additional capability beyond the 4 seats we have in Dragon. SpaceX had some of those concepts early on relative to additional astronauts. Right now, the seats have to rotate during entry, so it would be really difficult on the cargo pallet to install more seats. And, of course, then we would have to modify the ecosystem to handle flow to those suits for cooling and then also for air and then O2. So, we talked about it a little bit over the years, but we really don't have the time to implement such a system. And so we feel like we've gotten the best solution now, which would be to fly 2 up and then 4 back on Crew 9, should we need to employ this option.
And our next caller is Gina Sunseri with ABC News. You may go ahead.
Yes, is this the only major problem you see that causes you to have, with the RCS thrusters, that causes you to have call coming back on Dragon an alternative?
Yeah, really, it's the thrusters and combined with the helium leak. I talked about, if you had a helium leak that was so big that you couldn't, you isolated it and couldn't then repress a doghouse, that would be these 2 things, the helium leaks and really the thrusters are the 2 things that working together would give us concern relative to executing the remainder of the nominal mission, bringing Butch and Suni back on Starliner.
Our next caller is Megan Bartels with Scientific American. You may go ahead.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? Hello? Can you hear me okay?
We have you.
Oh, great. Thank you. I just wanted to echo everyone else's calls for having more regular press conferences and also for giving us access to Boeing and SpaceX representatives to talk about these issues. I did want to ask, I'm not sure who this would be, maybe for Dana, but if the Crew 9 contingency plan does fly, you mentioned, or someone mentioned, sending up 2 crew members and having ballast for the other 2 to replace the other 2 crew members. Can you talk about why it would be ballast and not like supplies for the space station, non-consumable material kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, what we're looking to do is replace the weight or the mass of a crew member in that seat, and so we can fly up some supplies, some additional foam in that seat, but there really is a metallic ballast config that SpaceX has built and would fly up in the seat just to make sure the center of gravity is unchanged. All these capsules have a pretty tight center of gravity, and the ballast would have to be flown in the seats on Dragon for that purpose.
And that is all we have time for today. Thank you all again for tuning in, and thank you for your questions. Thank you again to Ken, Steve, and Dana for participating and sharing the latest updates with us. We will continue to provide updates at blogs.nasa.gov/commercialcrew, and that will do it for us today. So thank you all again for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
And this concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time and have a great rest of your day.